How can a prosperous era suddenly collapse in just a few moons? Over 3,200 years ago, the Mediterranean and Near East were at the heart of an ancient globalized region, where mighty empires like Egypt, the Hittites, Menes, and Babylon thrived and expanded. But then, in 1177 BC, everything came crashing down. Cities burned to the ground, languages disappeared, and iron gradually replaced bronze, as civilization entered a dark age that would last for centuries. What happened? What thirst claimed the lives of those once great dynasties? To understand it all, we must trace the timeline back to the very beginning. True to its name, the Bronze Age was when humanity first laid its hands on this material and transformed it into a tool to shape a world of its own. With increasingly sophisticated smelting and metallurgical skills, ancient people learned to blend copper with tin or arsenic, creating a substance with superior hardness, later known as bronze. Over time, this durable, sharp, and versatile material began to replace stone, becoming more widely used for weapons, tools, household items, and even jewelry. Archaeological evidence shows that the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of Mesopotamian civilization, was the first birthplace of metallurgy. From here, the art of copper crafting spread throughout the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and many other regions, bringing profound changes to how humanity developed. This marked the shift from a nomadic, hunter-gatherer lifestyle to settled agricultural societies. Large urban centers began to rise, societies became more complexly stratified, and with this came the birth of the first writing systems. Copper was not just a material, but a symbol of evolution in both technology and thought. As the demand for it skyrocketed, mining activities, ore refining, and trade networks grew rapidly. This glorious age also gave rise to a series of historical wonders. These include the towering pyramids of Giza in the Egyptian desert, the magnificent Karnak temple stretching across 3 dynasties, and the wheel that emerged during the Uruk period of Mesopotamia. In the midst of this fervent development, the first multi-ethnic empire in human history, Akkad, was born. Following this came the rise of many other civilizations, such as the Assyrian Empire in Mesopotamia, the New Kingdom of Egypt, Babylon, the Hittite Empire on the Anatolian Peninsula, the Mycenaean civilization in Greece, and the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete. However, that glorious era did not last forever. Around 1200 BC, the Bronze Age rapidly entered a period of decline. In just a few decades, everything nearly collapsed entirely, leaving only Egypt, but even it was left in a state of exhaustion and severe weakness. But what was it that pushed everything to the brink? The first clues about the chaotic end of the Bronze Age were found at an important site on the Mediterranean coast, in what is now Syria. There, a letter inscribed on a clay tablet was discovered, believed to be from the king of Ugarit to the Cypriot Empire. It describes the scene of enemy forces sweeping in, burning cities, and ravaging the land. Meanwhile, the armies and chariots of Ugarit were hundreds of miles away, leaving the kingdom unable to defend itself. A final message from this kingdom also recorded the tragic state it was in. The army was scattered, cities collapsed, and food supplies were burned to the ground. Crops withered away amidst the brutal chaos. But it wasn't just Ugarit that faced such devastation. Almost simultaneously, the island of Cyprus was also invaded. The coastal cities in the west were set ablaze, while inland settlements were left untouched. The elite class who once lived here tried to bury their valuable possessions, hoping that one day they could return. But sadly, that day would never come. The situation in Greece was no better. Throughout the previous century, the Mycenaeans had been tormented by internal instability. Ruins show signs of large fires, along with arrows and weapons, creating a clear picture of a fierce battle in which the defenders ultimately failed. Other cities were burned in the central palace areas, indicating a popular uprising that overthrew the local rulers. Yet, some areas were abandoned due to famine, natural disasters, or perhaps both. The situation in Anatolia, the homeland of the Hittites, was even worse. Archaeological evidence shows that every major city here was destroyed, particularly along the coastal regions. This was almost absolute. For a long time, the sudden collapse across such a vast region remained a difficult question to explain. Historians acknowledge that the event occurred, but no one could say exactly how or why it happened. However, in the latter half of the 19th century, the sands of time in the Egyptian desert suddenly revealed shocking clues that disrupted all previous theories about the historical tragedy that had long been shrouded in silence. Here, an ancient inscribed tablet was discovered in the temple at Medinet Habu, recorded by Pharaoh Ramses III. It describes several waves of invasions by foreign armies that landed on the country's shores over a span of 30 years. In the face of these attacks, everything was immediately flattened and scattered in a chaotic battle. No nation could stand firm against their weapons. Egyptian history also provides vague information about the whereabouts of those who spread darkness. Over 3,000 years later, historians named this army the Sea Peoples. They did not come from a single nation, but were a scattered collection of various communities spread across the Mediterranean region, from the island of Sicily to Cyprus and the Aegean coastline. Some groups even originated from farther to the west. These people, under the banner of a loose alliance, were able to sweep through numerous ancient civilizations in smoke and despair. Their clothing was also not uniform. Some wore feathered hats, while others donned horned helmets. A few groups only covered their heads with simple pieces of leather. There were also warriors wearing short kilts like those of the Scots, or long coats that reached down to their knees. The only common thread among these exiles was their shared drive to leave their old lands behind. They did not come only with swords and shields but also brought their wives, children, belongings, and beliefs. Together, they boarded large ships and sailed to new lands, like a massive wave. It can be said that, on their journey sweeping through lands from the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia, almost no power was strong enough to withstand the Sea Peoples. But what made them so unstoppable? The answer lies in the symbol that determined both glory and destruction on ancient battlefields: the chariot, a two-wheeled vehicle pulled by horses. Initially, it was just a fast means of transportation for lords and nobles. But over time, it became the backbone of every army, from Babylon, the Hittites, and Assyrian to Egypt. The standard chariot of that era typically had 2 horses and 2 soldiers, one as the charioteer holding the reins, and the other as an archer shooting deadly arrows. The horses were carefully selected and trained for a long period to achieve exceptional speed and agility. When fully unleashed, their speed was twice that of infantry running at full sprint. Meanwhile, the archer used a compact composite bow, not too long but extremely powerful, capable of shooting long distances and piercing armor with ease. Thus, on the battlefield, the chariot combined 3 advantages: speed, range, and firepower. No other vehicle at the time could confront them head-on. To put it in perspective, when the battleship HMS Dreadnought was launched in 1906, every fleet in the world instantly became obsolete. It was faster, had greater range, and was stronger than any opponent. Just as the chariot had once dominated every ancient battlefield. But with glory came a very steep price. Raising horses, training soldiers, and crafting equipment all drained national resources. Moreover, horses are special creatures. They must be carefully selected and trained from a young age, and only specific regions could produce breeds that met the required standards. The weapons and armor for cavalry could not be mass-produced either, as each item required a meticulous crafting process. Losing a single chariot was not only a material loss but also a devastating blow to the entire formation. Therefore, alongside the chariots, additional infantry units were often deployed. Their role was to provide shielding, support, break the enemy's formation, or protect the chariots when they were under attack. But when the storm known as the Sea Peoples crashed onto the shores, what was once the supreme symbol of power was reduced to hopeless ruins. Unlike the ancient empires that relied on chariots escorted by shields, the Sea Peoples entered the battlefield with bare feet and gleaming swords. They brought with them light weapons, unconventional tactics, and a fire that could not be extinguished. Instead of moving in a tightly closed formation like the continuous blades of the armies of the Near East, this group spread out everywhere, breaking the traditional order and sneaking through unexpected paths. Their bands were a declaration of war against all classical tactics. They were not a slow, rigid army, but a dynamic wave, breaking through every blockade with ease. Small groups struck at weak points, cutting off any retreat and appearing like lightning on the battlefield. This sudden guerrilla tactic rendered the chariots, which were only effective when outpacing infantry, clumsy and vulnerable. Imagine a single chariot isolated in a field, surrounded by dozens of shadows from all directions. Unable to retreat, unable to turn around, the chariot became an easy prey in a trap that had already been set. And when the swords of the sea people struck the chariot, it shattered like brittle clay. The defending forces tried to establish rows of spears and pikes to hold their ground, but they were pierced from behind. Each formation splintered, and in the end, they faced a hopeless death. At that time, Egypt was the last stronghold that had not yet fallen, but its northern allies and western kingdoms had already been overwhelmed by the sea peoples. At Medinet Habu, a monumental battle was recorded in stone. The mighty pharaoh commanded the battlefield from his chariot, with spear-wielding soldiers behind him and rows of archers in front. Yet, despite this, the focal point was no longer the chariot, but the wall of men armed with bows and arrows, ready to strike down anyone who dared cross the river. Instead of showcasing their might with chariots, they set up ambushes with bows and crossbows, holding a defensive position. On the ground, the entire National Guard was deployed, with no one absent, no area left unguarded. Every meter of land along the river was a trap, waiting for the silent enemy to fall into it. The relief depicts the final scene, showing the sea peoples being led away in chains between the ranks of Egyptian soldiers. Right beside them, the bodies of the fallen lay at Pharaoh's feet, as if sending a message of dominance for eternity. Of course, this is an interpretation by the victorious side, carved in stone. But looking at the outcome that followed, no one could deny that the sea peoples were defeated at the mouth of the Nile. Despite the victory, Egypt had to pay a heavy price. The human losses were immense, and their resources were depleted. From that moment on, the land of the pharaohs, once at the height of its power, became a shadow of its former glory, left behind in the wake of its golden age. But this decline cannot solely be blamed on the mysterious invaders from the sea. Behind it was a chain reaction of collapses, starting with the disintegration of the continental trade networks. It was this silent yet serious breakdown that became the key for modern scholars to trace the true cause of the downfall. And the evidence they found not only fails to convince but also forces us to reconsider the entire logic of how the world operated during that period. All ancient civilizations relied on a core material to sustain their existence: bronze alloy. Without it, weapons became brittle, tools easily broken, and technological foundations quickly deteriorated. To create bronze, one needed to mix 90% pure copper with 10% refined tin. It's a simple ratio, but it required a very stable supply. While this mixture was not rare, its extraction was far from easy, especially with the primitive techniques of that time. Although many kingdoms had their own mines, it was the island of Sifnos that truly became the metal heart of the entire region. Here, the land was almost saturated with copper, and mining was a straightforward process, using basic tools to extract the resources from the earth. This made Sifnos a powerful economic hub and a crucial link in the vast network of material exchange. In contrast, tin was a material that was hard to find and extremely scarce, to the point that it could determine the fate of entire civilizations. There was a small mine in Anatolia, tightly controlled by the Hittites, but its supply was far too limited for long-term use. Aside from that, there were hardly any lands in the region that could produce this precious metal. The largest supply of tin at that time was located far to the east, in what is now Afghanistan, thousands of miles away through treacherous mountain paths and deserts. The journey from there to Sifnos was a harsh and perilous one, filled with dangers such as theft, warfare, and the wrath of nature. Despite these challenges, the profit from this commodity was so great that merchants still braved every danger to transport each shipment westward. A few mining sites were used, but none were large enough to save a world that depended on bronze. Only the CW region, at the far west of the British Isles, had a supply comparable to the mines of Afghanistan. These sea voyages would take up to a year, navigating through ice and pirates, sometimes only to return with a few chunks of silver-gray ore. But if the journey was successful, the rewards were enough to make an entire dynasty hold its head high among the nations. From this, It is clear that even a small disruption in the tin distribution system could cause the entire metal industry to collapse like a sandcastle. Without bronze, that era would vanish. Therefore, many scholars believe that the raid of the Sea Peoples was just the final straw that broke the camel's back. What truly killed the Bronze Age civilizations was the destruction of global trade routes, which halted the production of weapons and tools. This led to the collapse of a series of empires that had once dominated the world. It was truly a vicious cycle. Each attack from the marauders of the sea disrupted trade activities, causing the flow of goods to grind to a halt. With trade blocked, nations lost access to essential resources for self-defense and recovery. This widespread weakness left the entire ancient world vulnerable to the next wave of destruction. As the great powers of the Bronze Age gradually dissolved, the prospect of a revival sank deeper into the shadows of despair. But was the truth really that simple, or were there unseen forces silently driving the empires toward their downfall? Even without considering the global trade shock, this region was already on the brink of collapse. According to experts, the migration wave of the Sea Peoples coincided with a period of over 50 years during which the Near East was ravaged by a series of massive earthquakes. Archaeological evidence also shows that cities in Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and the wealthy coastal cities of Sifnos were destroyed by these catastrophic seismic events. Among these, mainland Greece seemed to suffer the most severe damage, to the point where it almost lost its original identity. It wasn't until recent times that things began to become clearer. Sediment samples and tree rings from northern Europe revealed evidence of a severe climate crisis. This forced the inhabitants to rapidly migrate southward in search of survival. In the end, it all became a link in a chain reaction. When nature raged, humanity struggled to escape, and civilizations collapsed without fully understanding what was happening. What was surprising, however, was that the eastern Mediterranean region was even more heavily affected. Even ancient pollen samples from northern Syria show evidence of a prolonged drought lasting 300 years, starting right before the collapse of the early Bronze Age. The situation was even far worse on the island of Sifnos. Environmental changes were so severe that rainfall was no longer sufficient to sustain even basic agricultural activities. And, of course, this was undoubtedly a disaster. It may explain why many cities were abandoned long before the Sea Peoples appeared. A similar situation was also found in the Levant and Anatolia. In Greece, there is even evidence that over centuries, plants evolved to adapt to the increasingly dry environment, such as in Sama. The contents of letters found in the city of Ugarit further support this discovery. One letter, sent to the Ugaritic Empire, urgently requested grain, concluding with the statement, "This is a matter of survival." Another letter from the nearby city of Emma read, "If you do not come immediately, we will all die. You will not see a single living soul in this land." Thus, the devastation was not a fatal blow from some mysterious force. It was the result of many small cracks accumulating and magnifying to the point where it was impossible to hold them back. Erratic weather caused the land to become barren, sowing the seeds of failed harvests. The consequences spread, leading to famine that drove the population to despair. The cities were emptied of people, and the once bustling streets were now only filled with the sound of wind whistling through the cold ruins. As food became scarce, competition and conflict erupted within each community. The ruling class gradually lost control, while minority groups began to rise. Regions that were once prosperous turned into empty trade ports, devoid of people. And then, at the height of the chaos, nameless armies from the sea landed, and entire layers of civilization were swept away like debris in a storm. No one was strong enough to rise again, and there was no one left to rebuild. The collision of 5 factors at once led to the inevitable end of the glorious Bronze Age.